The afternoon sun hung low over the busy streets of Atlanta, casting long shadows that stretched across the bustling city. The air was thick with heat, and a light breeze rustled the leaves of the trees lining the sidewalks. Emily Johnson, a tall, striking woman with deep brown skin and sharp, intelligent eyes, sat in her unmarked black SUV, her mind racing as she navigated through the traffic. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, the weight of months of hard work and investigation pressing down on her shoulders. Emily had been an FBI special agent for nearly a decade, and though her journey had been far from easy, she wore her badge with pride. She had risen through the ranks, overcoming countless challenges, not just as a woman, but as a black woman in a predominantly white, male-dominated field. The pressure to prove herself, to be twice as good, was something she had lived with her entire career. And yet, here she was, on the brink of cracking open one of the biggest cases of her life. Emily was nearing a breakthrough in a months-long investigation into a dangerous drug cartel that had been spreading its influence throughout the southern United States. She had pieced together clues, worked late nights, and coordinated with local law enforcement to gather intel. Her instincts told her she was close. Just one more piece of the puzzle, and the entire operation would come crashing down. Despite the long hours and relentless pressure, she felt a sense of purpose, of pride in her work. She knew what she was doing mattered. But as she drove through the city that warm afternoon, a familiar knot of tension began to form in her stomach. It wasn't the kind of tension that came from the investigation. It was something deeper, more personal. The glances, the stares she would get, even while wearing her badge. The subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, reminders that she was an outsider. A black woman in a position of authority. She had dealt with it all her life, first in school, then in college, and now in the FBI. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she achieved, there were always those who doubted her, who dismissed her because of the color of her skin. Emily pushed those thoughts aside as she approached a red light. She needed to stay focused. The cartel leader she had been tracking was getting nervous, and that meant they were likely to make a mistake soon. Her phone buzzed in the center console, and she glanced down at the screen. A message from her partner, Jason, flashed across it. "Need you back at the office ASAP. New intel just came in." She sighed, her fingers tapping the steering wheel impatiently. She was tired, but the adrenaline that came with being so close to a breakthrough kept her alert. Just a little longer, she told herself. Just a little longer, and we'll have them. As the light turned green, Emily accelerated, weaving through traffic as her mind replayed the latest details of the case. She could feel it, like a storm on the horizon. Something was about to break. She just didn't know how close that storm really was. Scene 2. The stop Emily was about 5 minutes from the FBI field office when the flashing blue and red lights appeared in her rearview mirror. The sudden burst of color caught her off guard, and her eyes immediately darted down to the speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Her license plates were registered to the FBI. Confused, she glanced back up at the patrol car behind her, its siren blaring, signaling her to pull over. "What in the world?" she muttered under her breath, flicking on her turn signal and slowly pulling off to the side of the road. She had no idea why she was being stopped, but as a federal agent, she knew the protocol. It was probably a mistake. Maybe the officer hadn't run her plates yet. She rolled her shoulders, trying to shake off the sense of unease creeping up her spine. Her badge was in her bag on the passenger seat, her credentials ready to be shown. This would be over in a minute, she reassured herself. The officer would realize who she was, and they would move on. But as the patrol car pulled up behind her, a heavy, uneasy feeling settled in the pit of her stomach. The officer who stepped out was tall, white, with a stern expression that made her frown. He looked tense, his posture rigid as he approached her driver's side window. His hand rested casually on the holster of his gun, a gesture that sent a spike of adrenaline through Emily's veins. She rolled down the window, keeping her movement slow and deliberate, just like she had been trained to do. The last thing she wanted was for this situation to escalate. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem?" The officer, whose name badge read James, barely acknowledged her greeting. His eyes flicked over her face with a cold, dismissive look. "License and registration," he barked, his voice devoid of any courtesy. Emily blinked, momentarily taken aback by his tone. She had encountered difficult officers before. Her work in law enforcement had introduced her to all kinds of personalities. But there was something different about this. Something off. Remaining professional, Emily reached into her bag for her FBI badge, holding it out for him to see. "I'm Special Agent Emily Johnson with the FBI," she explained, keeping her voice steady. "Here's my badge." James barely glanced at the badge before his frown deepened. "I said license and registration," he repeated, his voice sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Something wasn't right. Her instincts, honed over years of working dangerous cases, were screaming at her now. She had been trained to handle high-stress situations, but this felt different. There was an air of hostility, a racial undertone that she couldn't ignore. She had faced racism before, but this was something more dangerous. "Officer," she began, keeping her tone calm and measured. "I'm a federal agent. I'm on official duty. Here's my badge and identification." "Step out of the vehicle," James interrupted, his voice rising in volume. Emily stared at him, a mix of shock and disbelief washing over her. "Excuse me?" James's face twisted into an ugly sneer. "I said step out of the vehicle," he growled, his hand now resting on his gun in a way that made it clear this was no longer a request. It was a threat. Emily's heart raced as she realized just how wrong this situation had gone. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't violating any traffic laws. There was no reason for this stop to escalate like this. But it wasn't about the law. It was about something else. Something that ran far deeper. Racial bias. Power. Control. She knew her rights. As a federal agent, she had dealt with local law enforcement many times, but she had never been treated with such blatant disrespect, with such contempt for her authority and status. The weight of it settled over her, heavy and suffocating, and for the first time in years, she felt vulnerable. Not because of the badge she wore, but because of the color of her skin. Slowly, she opened the car door and stepped out, keeping her hands visible at all times. She knew better than to make any sudden movements. The people passing by on the street began to slow down, their curious eyes fixed on the scene unfolding before them. Emily could hear whispers, see the glint of a phone being raised to record, but no one stepped in. No one offered to help. James advanced toward her, his hand gripping her arm roughly as he shoved her against the side of the car. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and for a brief moment she was too stunned to speak. "What are you doing?" Emily finally managed to protest, her voice laced with anger and disbelief. "Resisting arrest, huh?" James sneered, twisting her arm behind her back. "You think you can flash that badge and do whatever you want?" Emily winced as the handcuffs tightened around her wrists, the cold metal biting into her skin. She couldn't believe what was happening. This wasn't just an abuse of power, it was an assault on her identity, her dignity, her very humanity. People were staring now, openly watching, some even recording. But no one intervened. No one challenged James's authority. The heat of embarrassment and anger burned in Emily's chest, but she kept her head held high. She had done nothing wrong. She wasn't going to let this man, this racist, break her spirit. "Officer James," she said firmly, though her voice trembled slightly from the sheer rage boiling inside her. "You're making a mistake. I'm a federal agent, and when this is over, you'll regret this." "Shut your mouth," James snapped, his face inches from hers. "You think you're better than everyone else because you work for the FBI? Well, let me tell you something. You're not above the law." Emily's mind raced, trying to stay calm, trying to figure out her next move, but it felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. Her colleagues at the FBI would never believe this. Arrested for no reason, while on duty in broad daylight. This was beyond humiliating. It was a travesty of justice. James dragged her toward the patrol car, ignoring her every attempt to reason with him. As he shoved her into the back seat, Emily caught a glimpse of the people filming. Their expressions were a mix of shock and disbelief. But still, no one stepped forward. No one challenged James's actions. As the door slammed shut behind her, Emily took a deep breath, her wrists throbbing from the tight handcuffs. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The patrol car sped through the streets of Atlanta, the flashing lights casting harsh reflections off the surrounding buildings. Inside the back seat, Emily Johnson sat, her wrists throbbing from the handcuffs that had been too tightly secured. Her mind raced as she stared out the window, watching as the familiar city streets blurred by. This couldn't be happening. Emily's breath came in slow, measured inhales, a technique she had learned years ago in training to keep calm in high-pressure situations. But this was different. She had been trained to face dangerous criminals, to confront cartel leaders, to investigate the darkest corners of human behavior. But she hadn't been trained to deal with something like this. To be a victim of racial profiling and police brutality herself, a federal agent being treated like a common criminal because of the color of her skin. She shifted in her seat, testing the restraints around her wrists, but they didn't budge. James hadn't spoken a word since throwing her in the back of the patrol car. He hadn't told her why she was being detained, hadn't read her rights. Nothing. It was as if he didn't see her as a person at all, just another black face that he could impose his authority on. The patrol car suddenly turned off the main road and began heading into a quieter part of the city, away from the bustling downtown streets where the precinct she knew so well was located. Emily frowned, her mind alert. This wasn't the route to the main police station. This was somewhere else, somewhere unfamiliar. She leaned forward slightly, her pulse quickening as a new realization dawned on her. He wasn't taking her to the precinct. He was taking her somewhere off the grid, somewhere isolated. The knot in her stomach tightened as she understood the danger she was in. This wasn't just about a traffic stop gone wrong. This was about control, about power. James didn't want to arrest her. He wanted to teach her a lesson. He wanted to remind her of her place. And as far as he was concerned, her place wasn't as an FBI agent. It wasn't as someone with authority. Her place, in his eyes, was beneath him. The car pulled into a small parking lot in front of an old, nearly abandoned police substation on the outskirts of the city. The building looked dilapidated, with peeling paint and broken windows, like it hadn't been used in years. Emily's heart sank as the car came to a stop. The door opened, and James yanked her out, dragging her toward the entrance of the station. The few officers inside barely glanced at them as they passed the front desk. Emily took in their blank expressions, their indifferent gazes, and her stomach churned with anger and fear. They knew what was happening, and they didn't care. "Get in there," James barked, shoving her into a small interrogation room at the end of a narrow hallway. Emily stumbled but caught herself before she fell. She turned to face him, her eyes burning with defiance despite the fear gnawing at the edges of her composure. "You're violating my rights," she said, her voice steady but firm. "You have no reason to hold me, and when this is over, you're going to regret this." James sneered, pacing back and forth in front of her. "You think you can flash that FBI badge and get away with anything, don't you? But here, you're just another criminal." Emily glared at him, refusing to back down. "I'm a federal agent and you have no jurisdiction over me. This is an abuse of power, and I won't stand for it." "Shut up," James snapped, leaning in closer, his face inches from hers. "You think you're untouchable because you've got a badge? Well, let me tell you something. You're in my world now. And in my world, people like you don't get special treatment." Emily's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "People like me?" James's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, the mask of professionalism he had worn earlier slipped, revealing the raw, ugly truth beneath. "You know exactly what I mean." The racial hatred, the contempt, was laid bare between them now. This wasn't about the law. This was about something far more insidious. Emily had seen this kind of hatred before, but never this close, never so personal. She had spent her entire career fighting to prove herself, fighting to be seen as more than just her skin color. And now here she was, being treated like she didn't belong, like she was a threat. She had heard the stories, seen the headlines. Black men and women pulled over for no reason, arrested, brutalized, and even killed by police who saw their skin color as a weapon. But she had never imagined that one day she would be the one sitting in that interrogation room, feeling the cold grip of injustice around her wrists. James straightened up, his smirk returning. You think you're going to walk out of here and tell your FBI buddies what happened? Think again. Without another word, he turned and left the room, the door slamming. She had to. Hours passed, though it felt like days. Emily sat in the small, dimly lit room, her thoughts spiraling as she replayed every moment of her arrest. She tried to keep her mind focused on the facts, on what she needed to do to get out of this. But the anger, the humiliation, was overwhelming. She had always known that being a black woman in law enforcement came with its own set of challenges. She had faced subtle racism, the microaggressions, the comments about her tone, or how she was too aggressive. But this was blatant. This was hate, pure and simple, and it burned in her chest like a fire she couldn't put out. The door opened again, and another officer walked in. This one was younger, maybe in his early 30s, with a nervous expression on his face. He carried a small notebook and file under his arm, and he glanced at her with what almost seemed like guilt. I'm Officer Mitchell, he said cautiously, his voice unsure. I was told to process you for holding. Emily studied him closely. He wasn't like James. There was no arrogance, no sneer. He looked uncomfortable, as if he knew what was happening wasn't right, but he didn't have the courage to say anything. Agent Johnson, Emily said, her voice low but firm. You know this isn't right. You know what he's doing. Mitchell hesitated, his pen frozen in midair as he scribbled something in his notebook. He glanced at the door, then back at her, his eyes flickering with something she hadn't seen in hours. Doubt. I don't make the rules, he muttered under his breath. Emily leaned forward, her voice soft but urgent. You might not make the rules, but you can decide whether or not to follow orders that you know are wrong. Mitchell swallowed hard, his pen trembling in his hand. For a moment, their eyes met, and Emily could see the internal struggle playing out on his face. He was scared, scared of what James might do, scared of the consequences of going against his superior. But he also knew that what was happening wasn't just wrong, it was illegal. Before Mitchell could respond, the door flew open again, and James stormed in, his expression dark and angry. What's taking so long? He barked, glaring at Mitchell. Mitchell jumped to his feet, his notebook nearly slipping from his grasp. I was just getting the basic information, sir. James sneered, clearly unimpressed. Get her into holding already. We don't have all day. Emily's heart raced as Mitchell scrambled to follow orders, avoiding her gaze as he stood up. But she wasn't done yet. She couldn't let this slide, not without trying one last time to get through to him. You're making a mistake, Emily said, her voice steady and authoritative, though her heart pounded in her chest. This is going to come back on you. I guarantee it. James laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the walls of the small room. Oh, I'm sure you think so, sweetheart. But in this town, nobody cares about your so-called authority. You think just because you have a fancy FBI badge, you're untouchable? Think again. Emily met his gaze, refusing to back down. I'm not here to impress you, James. I'm here to do my job. And trust me, the people who do care are going to come for you. For a moment, something flickered in James's eyes. Uncertainty, doubt. But it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the smug arrogance that seemed to define him. He waved his hand dismissively at Mitchell. Get her out of my sight. Mitchell nodded, quickly grabbing Emily by the arm and leading her out of the room. As they walked down the narrow hallway toward the holding cells, Emily kept her head held high, even though every part of her wanted to scream. She wasn't going to let James break her spirit. He could arrest her, humiliate her, try to strip her of her dignity, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her defeated. Emily sat on the cold metal bench inside the holding cell, the walls around her closing in like a cage. The cell was small and dimly lit, the air thick with the stench of mildew and old sweat. It was a far cry from the sterile, well-lit offices of the FBI headquarters where she usually worked, and the stark contrast only served to heighten her sense of isolation. Her wrists were still cuffed, the metal biting into her skin, but that wasn't what bothered her the most. It was the helplessness, the feeling of being trapped, not just physically, but emotionally, mentally. She had always prided herself on being in control, on being the one to call the shots. But now she was the one being controlled. being manipulated by a man who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to be crushed. She replayed the events of the day in her mind over and over again, trying to make sense of how she had ended up here. She had been driving back to her office, thinking about her case, her job, her life. And then, in the blink of an eye, everything had changed. One moment, she was an FBI agent, respected and feared by criminals alike. The next, she was sitting in a jail cell, her freedom stolen from her by a man who didn't even see her as human. The door to the holding area creaked open, and Emily looked up, her heart skipping a beat. It was Mitchell again, his face pale and drawn, but there was something different in his eyes this time. Determination, maybe, or guilt. "I'm getting you out of here," he said quietly, glancing over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. Emily's pulse quickened. "What?" Mitchell fumbled with the keys, unlocking the cell door. "We don't have much time. James is distracted, but he'll be back soon. We need to move." Emily hesitated for a moment, unsure of whether to trust him. But she knew she didn't have any other options. If Mitchell was willing to help, she had to take the chance. Without another word, she followed him out of the cell, her heart pounding in her chest as they made their way through the dimly lit station. Every step felt like a risk, every shadow a potential threat. But they couldn't stop. Not now. They reached the back exit, and Mitchell unlocked the door, his hands shaking slightly as he pushed it open. The cool night air hit Emily's face, sharp and refreshing, and for the first time in hours, she felt a glimmer of hope. "This is your chance," Mitchell said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the city in the distance. "Get out of here, before James catches on." Emily looked at him, her mind racing. Could she trust him? Or was this some kind of trap? She didn't have time to think it through. With a deep breath, she nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Mitchell gave her a small, tight-lipped smile, and then she was gone, disappearing into the night. Emily's feet pounded the pavement as she sprinted through the dark, narrow alleyways of the city, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The night was quiet, save for the occasional distant sound of traffic or a siren, but in her mind, every noise was amplified, every shadow a potential threat. She had no idea where she was going. All she knew was that she had to keep moving, keep running. James would figure out she was gone soon enough, and when he did, he wouldn't stop until he found her. She had seen the look in his eyes, the twisted satisfaction of a man who thrived on power, a man who saw her as a threat to his control. As she turned down another alley, Emily slowed her pace, her legs burning from the effort. She needed to think. She couldn't just run blindly through the streets. She had to come up with a plan, a way to stay ahead of James and to bring him down for what he had done. Her mind raced through her options. She needed help. But who could she trust? She couldn't go to the local police, not with James having so much influence over the precinct, and she couldn't contact her team at the FBI without risking her location being tracked. But there was one person she could call, someone she knew she could trust: Jackson. Agent Jackson had been her partner on countless cases, and he was one of the few people in the Bureau who had always had her back, no matter what. He owed her more than a few favors, and if anyone could help her, it was him. Glancing around to make sure she wasn't being followed, Emily ducked into a small gas station at the edge of a deserted road. The dim lights flickered overhead as she made her way to the payphone, her heart still racing with the urgency of the situation. She fumbled in her pocket for change, her hands shaking as she dialed the number from memory. The phone rang once, twice, and then, "Jackson." Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "It's me." "Emily, what's going on? Where are you?" She glanced around the empty gas station, her voice low. "I'm in trouble, Jackson. Big trouble. I was arrested by a cop, James. He's corrupt, and I think he's trying to cover something up. He detained me for no reason, didn't even read me my rights, and now I'm on the run." There was a pause on the other end of the line as Jackson absorbed the gravity of her words. When he spoke again, his voice was tense. "Are you safe?" "For now," she replied, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was true. "But James is looking for me. I need help, Jackson. I need backup." Jackson's voice softened with concern. "I'm on it. But listen, you need to lay low until I can get to you." This guy sounds dangerous. Don't do anything rash. I know, Emily said, glancing out the window toward the empty road beyond. But we don't have much time. If James finds me before you do, I don't know what he'll do. I'll get a team together, Jackson assured her. But you need to stay hidden. Don't use your phone. If he's as dirty as you say he is, he'll be watching for any signs of communication. I understand, Emily said, her mind already working on how to stay off the grid. Just get here as fast as you can. I will, Jackson said, his voice full of determination. Stay safe, Emily. I've got your back. As the line went dead, Emily hung up the phone, her hands trembling with a mix of relief and fear. She had backup on the way, but that didn't mean she was safe yet. James was out there, somewhere, and he wouldn't stop until he had her under his control again. Taking a deep breath, Emily stepped out of the gas station and back into the night. She needed to keep moving. She couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. Every second counted. James paced back and forth inside the nearly deserted police station, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He had known the minute he had left Emily in that holding cell that she was trouble. She had that defiant look in her eyes, that sense of superiority that always came from someone who thought they were above the law. And now she was gone. He had underestimated her. That much was clear. But he wasn't about to let her slip through his fingers. He had too much at stake. Too much to lose if she managed to expose what he had been doing. And he wasn't about to let some black FBI agent come in and ruin everything he had built. His hands clenched into fists at his sides as he thought about her, about the way she had looked at him, like he was nothing more than a racist thug. She didn't understand. She didn't know what it was like to be in his position, to have to fight for control in a world that was constantly slipping away. The door to the station creaked open, and one of his fellow officers, Mitchell, stepped inside, his face pale and drawn. James turned to face him, his eyes narrowing. "What are you doing here?" Mitchell shifted uncomfortably under James's gaze, avoiding eye contact. I was just checking to see if you needed anything." James snorted, his lip curling in disdain. "Don't pretend like you care. You've been acting like a scared little puppy ever since this whole thing started. What's the matter, Mitchell? Feeling guilty?" Mitchell swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the floor. I don't think we should have detained her like that. She's FBI, James. This could come back on us." James's eyes flashed with anger, and he took a step toward Mitchell, his voice low and menacing. "You listen to me, and you listen good. I don't care who she works for. I don't care what kind of badge she has. In this town, I'm the one in control. Not her, not the FBI, me." Mitchell flinched but didn't argue. He knew better than to push James when he was in one of his moods. James sneered, turning away from him. "Now get out of here. I've got work to do." Mitchell hesitated for a moment, then nodded quickly and left the room, leaving James alone with his thoughts once again. As he stood there in the silence, James's mind began to churn with plans. He wasn't going to let Emily get away with this. He wasn't going to let her expose him. He had connections, people in high places who owed him favors. He would find her, and when he did, she would regret ever crossing him. Emily found herself deep within the outskirts of Atlanta, where the city's noise and bustle faded into the background, replaced by a quiet eeriness. The streets were empty, and the buildings grew fewer and farther between, until she found herself in an almost rural area on the edge of the city limits. She had been running for hours now, her legs aching, her mind racing as she tried to stay ahead of James. Every minute felt like a gamble, every shadow a potential trap. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. The sound of a car engine broke the silence, and Emily ducked behind a row of hedges, her heart racing in her chest. She watched as a patrol car drove past, its lights off, the driver scanning the area with a cold, calculating gaze. It wasn't James, but that didn't mean she was safe. He could have sent someone else to look for her. He had resources, people who would do his dirty work for him if it meant keeping their jobs. As the car disappeared into the distance, Emily let out a breath she hadn't realized she had been holding. She needed to find a place to hide, at least until Jackson could get to her. But where? She spotted a small rundown motel on the other side of the road. The neon sign flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot. It wasn't much, but it was something. A place to lay low for a few hours, maybe get some rest. Making sure the coast was clear, Emily crossed the road and approached the motel. The front desk was empty, the clerk nowhere to be seen, and she quickly paid for a room in cash, using an alias she had used on previous undercover operations. She didn't want to take any chances. The room was small and dingy, the walls yellowed with age, and the bed looked like it hadn't been changed in weeks. But Emily didn't care. She locked the door behind her and sank onto the edge of the bed, her body trembling with exhaustion. For the first time since her arrest, she allowed herself a moment of vulnerability. The adrenaline that had been keeping her going all night was starting to wear off, leaving her with nothing but the raw, emotional weight of what had happened. She had always known that being a black woman in law enforcement would come with challenges. She had faced discrimination before, subtle comments, looks, the unspoken assumption that she didn't belong. But this was something else entirely. James hadn't just seen her as a threat to his control. He had seen her as a less than human, as someone he could treat with disdain and violence because of the color of her skin. And that was what hurt the most. Not the physical pain, but the emotional scars that came from being reminded, once again, that no matter how far she had come, no matter how hard she had worked, she would always be judged by people like James. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She couldn't let this break her. She had worked too hard, fought too long, to let someone like James destroy everything she had built. Taking a deep breath, Emily forced herself to stand. She couldn't stay here. She had to keep moving, keep fighting. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been judged, mistreated, or oppressed because of the color of their skin. She was going to take James down, and she was going to do it the right way, by the book, by the law. And when it was over, he would have to answer for every crime he had committed, every person he had hurt. With renewed determination, Emily grabbed her things and left the motel room, stepping back into the cool night air. The fight wasn't over yet. The night had grown colder, and the air carried a biting chill as Emily left the rundown motel behind. She needed to keep moving, to stay ahead of James, who was undoubtedly combing the city for her. She couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. She pulled her jacket tighter around her body as she walked through the back streets, staying in the shadows and avoiding the main roads. Her mind raced, running through possible scenarios, where James might be, how he might be tracking her, and most importantly, how to bring him down. She thought about Jackson, about the backup he had promised. But it had been hours now, and she hadn't heard anything. What if something had gone wrong? What if James had somehow intercepted the message and was now working to cut her off from the only lifeline she had? Emily felt the weight of exhaustion creeping in, both physically and mentally. She had been on the run for too long, her body aching from the adrenaline-fueled flight. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to, not until she had answers. The city's outskirts began to blend into the surrounding woods, and soon the narrow streets gave way to a dense forest. It was dark, the moon barely casting enough light to see more than a few feet ahead. But Emily welcomed the cover. The forest was quiet, isolated, a good place to hide if necessary. As she ventured deeper into the woods, the branches overhead seemed to close in around her, creating a natural barrier from the outside world. The sounds of the city faded into the background, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. But even in the silence, Emily felt on edge. James had proven himself to be relentless, and she knew he wouldn't stop until he found her. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind, sent her heart racing. Was it just the forest's natural sounds, or was someone following her? She stopped for a moment, crouching low behind a tree, listening. Her breath came in quiet, controlled gasps as she strained to hear any movement. For several minutes, there was nothing but the steady beat of her own heart, but then faintly she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Her muscles tensed. It could be anyone, but she couldn't take any chances. Slowly, Emily rose from her crouch and began to move again, this time more carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. She needed to find a place to hide or, at the very least, a way to stay out of sight. The footsteps were getting closer, and panic began to gnaw at the edges of her mind. She glanced around, searching for anything that might provide shelter. Up ahead, she spotted what looked like an old, abandoned cabin nestled between the trees. It wasn't much, but it was something. With a quick glance over her shoulder to make sure she wasn't being followed too closely, Emily made her way toward the cabin, slipping inside and closing the door behind her as quietly as possible. The interior was small, dusty, and dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through cracks in the walls. There was barely any furniture, just a couple of old chairs and a table that looked like it had seen better days. Emily crouched down behind the table, her back pressed against the wall as she listened for any signs of movement outside. The footsteps were still there, but they had slowed, as if the person, or people, were searching for something, or someone. She reached for her side, feeling for the comforting weight of her firearm. It was still there, hidden beneath her jacket. She hadn't used it yet, and she didn't want to, not unless she had no other choice. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she waited, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear someone moving around outside, their steps slow and deliberate, as if they knew she was inside. A hand brushed the door and it creaked open, just a fraction. Emily tensed, her fingers gripping the gun beneath her jacket. The door opened wider, and a shadowy figure stepped into the cabin, their face obscured by the darkness. For a moment there was silence. Then the figure spoke, their voice low and threatening. "I know you're in here, Emily." Her heart dropped. It was James. He stepped further into the cabin, his eyes scanning the room. "You really thought you could run from me? That you could hide?" Emily remained perfectly still, her body pressed as tightly against the wall as possible. She didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. James was only a few feet away now, and she could hear the cold, smug satisfaction in his voice. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long," James continued, his voice growing colder. "But it ends tonight." Emily's mind raced. She couldn't let him find her, couldn't let him corner her, but she also couldn't just sit there, waiting for him to make the first move. With a quick, decisive movement, she sprang to her feet, gun drawn and pointed directly at James. "Stop right there, James, it's over." James froze, his eyes narrowing as they locked on hers. For a moment, there was a tense silence as the two stared each other down. Then slowly, a twisted smile spread across James's face. "You think you can scare me, Agent Johnson?" he sneered. "You're out of your element. You think the FBI badge makes you untouchable? But out here, you're just another target." Emily's grip tightened on the gun. "I'm not afraid of you, James, and you're not getting away with this." James laughed, a cold, bitter sound that echoed through the small cabin. "Oh, but I already have. No one's coming to save you. Your precious backup isn't coming. And even if they were, I'd make sure you were long gone before they arrived." Emily's mind raced. She needed to find a way out of this situation, to stall him long enough for Jackson and the team to get to her. But James was dangerous, more dangerous than she had realized. Suddenly, James lunged at her, his hand reaching for the gun. Emily stepped back, her finger hovering over the trigger, but before she could fire, James knocked the gun from her hand. It skidded across the floor, disappearing into the shadows. James grinned, a twisted, predatory look in his eyes. "Now what, Agent Johnson?" Without thinking, Emily lashed out, her fist connecting with James's jaw. He staggered back, caught off guard by the sudden blow, but quickly recovered, his face twisting into a snarl. "You're going to pay for that," he growled, advancing on her. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, searching for anything she could use as a weapon. Her hand brushed against the edge of the table and she grabbed it, swinging it toward James with all her strength. The table hit him square in the chest, knocking him off balance, but he recovered quickly, his eyes burning with rage. "You're only making this worse for yourself." Emily didn't respond. She knew she couldn't overpower him, not physically, but she wasn't going to go down without a fight. James lunged at her again, and this time Emily was ready. She sidestepped his attack, grabbing a nearby chair and swinging it toward him. The chair hit him in the side, and he grunted in pain, but it only seemed to fuel his anger. "You're finished, Emily," he spat, his voice full of venom. "When I'm done with you, no one will even remember your name." Emily's mind raced as she dodged his next attack, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She needed to end this, but how? Suddenly, the sound of approaching sirens pierced the night, and James froze, his eyes widening in shock. Emily didn't waste a second. She lunged for her gun, grabbing it from the floor and aiming it at James. "It's over, James. Backup's here." James's face twisted in fury, but he didn't move. The sirens grew louder, and Emily could see the flashing lights of police cars approaching in the distance. For a moment, there was silence. Then with a snarl, James turned and bolted out the door, disappearing into the darkness. Emily stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, her gun still raised. She didn't chase after him. She couldn't. Not now. As the police cars arrived and officers poured into the cabin, Emily finally allowed herself to breathe. It wasn't over yet, but for now, she was safe. The police swarmed the area, their flashlights cutting through the dense woods as they searched for any sign of James. Emily stood near the cabin, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process everything that had just happened. She had come so close to being caught, so close to losing everything. But now, thanks to Jackson and the team, she had a chance to set things right. Jackson approached her, his face full of concern. "Are you okay?" Emily nodded, though she still felt the weight of the night pressing down on her. "I'm fine. But James, he's still out there." "We'll find him," Jackson assured her. "We've got officers combing the area. He won't get far." Emily nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unease. James was dangerous, more dangerous than she had realized, and she knew he wouldn't stop until he got what he wanted. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Not yet. As the officers continued their search, Emily leaned against the cabin, her mind racing. She had come so far, but the fight wasn't over yet. James was still out there, and she knew he wouldn't stop until he had taken everything from her. But she wouldn't let that happen. She would fight, and she would win. The forest had fallen eerily silent as the police search team fanned out, scouring the area for any sign of James. Emily stood by the cabin, feeling the weight of the night pressing down on her. She had narrowly escaped his grasp, but she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Jackson approached her, his face full of determination. "We've got units covering every exit and we're monitoring the highways. He won't get far." Emily nodded, but her gut told her that James was still close. He wasn't the type to run without finishing what he'd started. She could feel it in the air, the tension, the unfinished business between them. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see a message from Agent Wilson, one of her trusted colleagues at the FBI. The message was brief. "We're getting closer to solid evidence. Hang tight." Emily's heart raced. The investigation into James's corruption was finally gaining traction, and soon they would have the proof they needed to take him down. But the question lingered in her mind. Would she survive long enough to see it happen? Jackson studied her closely. "Emily, are you sure you're okay? You don't need to keep pushing yourself. Let us handle the rest." Emily shook her head. "No, I'm not backing down. I need to see this through, Jackson. James isn't just going to fade into the background. He'll come for me again." Jackson frowned, clearly uneasy. "You're right, but I don't like the idea of you being the bait." Emily looked him square in the eyes, her voice steady. "I've been dealing with people like James my entire career. He's fueled by control, by a twisted sense of power. He won't stop until he feels like he's won." Jackson sighed but nodded in agreement. "All right, but we do this by the book. No more running. If James makes a move, we take him down, and we do it clean." Emily agreed, but deep down, she knew that this wasn't going to be a clean confrontation. James was too far gone for that. He had nothing left to lose, and that made him even more dangerous. The sound of a helicopter overhead signaled the intensity of the search. Emily's eyes tracked the beam of its spotlight as it swept over the dense woods, casting long shadows on the ground. She glanced at the officers, armed and ready, patrolling the perimeter. They were ready for a fight, but they had no idea what they were truly up against. Hours passed, and the night deepened. The air grew colder, and the forest seemed to close in around them. Despite the increased police presence, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that James was still watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She stepped away from the cabin, walking deeper into the woods where the trees were thickest. The darkness was suffocating, and each rustle of leaves sent a chill down her spine. Her instincts were sharp, honed by years of fieldwork, and she knew better than to ignore them. Suddenly she heard it, a faint snap of a branch behind her. Emily froze, her hand instinctively reaching for her gun. She listened, heart pounding, as the sound came closer. Someone was there, following her. She moved silently through the woods, careful not to give away her position. She could feel the tension building, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Whoever was behind her was trying to be quiet, but not quiet enough. Emily ducked behind a large tree, waiting for her pursuer to reveal himself. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. She held her breath, her fingers tightening around her gun. Then out of the shadows he appeared, James. His face was twisted with rage, his eyes wild as they scanned the area, searching for her. He was clutching a weapon, a long knife glinting in the moonlight. Emily's heart raced. This was it, the final confrontation. "You can't hide forever, Emily," James snarled, his voice low and menacing. "You think you're smart, don't you? Think you can outsmart me?" Emily didn't respond. She stayed hidden, watching his every move. He was on edge, desperate, and she knew that made him unpredictable. "I've been patient," James continued, pacing back and forth. "But now? Now I'm done playing games." Emily took a deep breath, her mind racing. She could try to take him down now, but one wrong move and she could end up dead. She needed to lure him in, make him underestimate her. Slowly, she stepped out from behind the tree, her gun raised. "It's over, James. You're done." James's eyes snapped to her, and a twisted smile spread across his face. "Over? No, Agent Johnson. This is just beginning." He lunged at her, knife raised, but Emily was ready. She sidestepped his attack, grabbing his wrist and twisting it, forcing the knife from his hand. It clattered to the ground, and James howled in pain, but he quickly recovered, swinging at her with his other hand. Emily ducked, landing a solid punch to his gut. James staggered back, rage flashing in his eyes. "You think you can beat me, you arrogant—" He lunged at her again, but this time Emily was faster. She swept his legs out from under him, sending him crashing to the ground. Before he could react, she had her gun pointed directly at his head. "Don't move," she said, her voice cold and steady. "It's over." James lay there, breathing heavily, his eyes locked on hers. For a moment, it seemed like he might surrender, but then with a snarl he lunged at her one last time, knocking the gun from her hand. The two of them grappled on the forest floor, each fighting for control. Emily could feel his desperation, his need to dominate, to win. But she wasn't going to let him, not this time. With a swift, decisive movement, she twisted his arm behind his back and slammed him to the ground. James groaned in pain, but Emily didn't let up. She held him there, her knee pressed into his back as she reached for her handcuffs. "You're under arrest," she said, her voice filled with finality, "for assault, corruption, and obstruction of justice." James laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "You think this will end me? You think I won't come after you again?" Emily tightened the cuffs around his wrists, her grip firm. "You won't get the chance." Back at the cabin, the officers were waiting, their guns drawn as they watched Emily lead James into the clearing. His face was bloodied, his shirt torn, but there was still a smugness in his eyes that made Emily's stomach churn. Jackson approached, his expression grim. "You got him." Emily nodded, though she didn't feel the victory yet. James wasn't just a man. He was the embodiment of everything she had fought against: racism, corruption, abuse of power. And while she had him in handcuffs, she knew that taking him down was only the beginning. "Get him out of here," Jackson ordered, motioning to the other officers. "Make sure he's processed by the book. No mistakes." As the officers led James away, Emily felt a wave of exhaustion wash over her. She had been running, fighting, for what felt like forever. And now, finally, it was over. Or at least, this part of it was. Jackson came to stand beside her, his expression softening. "You did it, Emily." Emily nodded, though her mind was already racing with thoughts of what came next. James might be in custody, but she knew that the corruption in the system ran deep. There were others like him, hiding behind their badges, using their authority to oppress and control. "I did," she said, her voice quiet. "But this is just the beginning." Jackson placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've made a difference tonight, Emily, and we'll keep fighting. We'll root out every last one of them." Emily looked up at the night sky, the stars twinkling overhead. She had fought so hard for justice, for accountability, and now, standing in the aftermath of her battle with James, she felt a sense of purpose stronger than ever. "I won't stop," she said, her voice filled with determination. "Not until the system is changed, not until there's real justice." Jackson smiled, though there was a sadness in his eyes. "You're a good agent, Emily. The FBI needs more people like you." Emily met his gaze, her heart heavy but resolute. "The world needs more people willing to stand up to men like James." The next morning, as the sun began to rise over the horizon, Emily stood in front of the FBI headquarters, her body aching from the fight, but her spirit unbroken. She had been through hell, but she had survived. And now, she was ready to take the next step. Inside, she met with her team, Jackson, Agent Wilson, and the others who had worked tirelessly to gather evidence against James. The room was filled with files, reports, and documents detailing years of corruption, cover-ups, and abuse. "We've got enough to take him down for good," Agent Wilson said, his voice filled with satisfaction. "James is finished." Emily nodded, but she knew that this was just one victory in a much larger battle. There were still others like James, hidden in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike. But she wasn't afraid. She had faced the worst of them, and she had come out on top. As she left the meeting, the cool morning air filled her lungs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to breathe. She had won this fight, but the war for justice, for equality, was far from over. But Emily Johnson wasn't done fighting. Not yet. Emily sat in her office at FBI headquarters, the room still and quiet. It had been weeks since James's arrest, but the weight of everything she had endured still pressed heavily on her shoulders. The fallout from the case had been immense. Headlines dominated the news, and internal investigations had been launched across multiple law enforcement agencies. What James had done wasn't just an isolated incident. His corruption had spread far and wide, affecting many officers and officials who had covered for him or turned a blind eye to his abuses. Emily scrolled through her emails, reading the updates on the ongoing investigations. More arrests had been made, and more officers were being held accountable for their involvement in James's web of corruption. But the victory felt hollow. There was a long way to go before true reform could be achieved. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was Jackson. "We need to meet." His voice was serious, tinged with urgency. Emily agreed, knowing that whatever he had to tell her would be significant. She grabbed her coat and headed toward the conference room where they had agreed to meet. When she arrived, Jackson was already waiting, along with Agent Wilson and a few other key members of her team. The tension in the room was palpable. "Emily," Jackson started, his voice steady but filled with a sense of caution, "we've uncovered something bigger." Emily's pulse quickened. She had suspected this was coming. James's arrest had opened Pandora's box, and there was no telling how deep the corruption ran. Jackson slid a file across the table to her. "It's not just James. He was part of a larger network, an underground operation involving trafficking, extortion, and systematic racism embedded in several departments across the state." Emily opened the file, her eyes scanning the details. The names, dates, and evidence laid out before her painted a grim picture. This was far bigger than she had imagined. And worse, it involved high-ranking officials who had the power to bury the truth if they weren't careful. Her heart sank as the realization hit her. "How deep does this go?" she asked, though she already knew the answer would be devastating. Agent Wilson leaned forward. "It's deep, Emily. We're talking judges, politicians, even business leaders who've been working with James and his network. They've used their power to manipulate the system, keeping certain communities oppressed while they profit from it." Emily felt a surge of anger, but she knew they had to be strategic. This wasn't just about taking down one corrupt officer anymore. This was about dismantling an entire system of injustice. "We can't do this alone," she said, her voice steady. "We'll need public support, media coverage, and allies in high places. If we go after these people, they're going to come after us hard." Jackson nodded. "That's why we're bringing in a special task force. The FBI is backing us, but we need to be careful. The more we dig, the more dangerous this will get." Emily took a deep breath. She had known from the beginning that this wouldn't be easy, but the scale of what they were up against was staggering. Still, she had no intention of backing down. This was the fight she had trained for her entire life, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her now. "Let's get to work," she said firmly. As the investigation continued, Emily and her team found themselves facing increasing pressure from all sides. The media had picked up on the case, and public outrage was growing. Protests erupted across the city, with citizens demanding justice and an end to the systemic racism that had allowed people like James to thrive. Emily watched the news reports from her office, feeling a mix of hope and anxiety. The public was finally waking up to the reality of what was happening. But with that awareness came danger. Powerful people were being exposed, and they weren't going to go down without a fight. Her phone rang, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a call from Senator Harper, one of the few politicians who had publicly supported the FBI's investigation. "Agent Johnson, I wanted to commend you on the work you and your team have been doing," Senator Harper said, her voice warm but cautious. "But I have to warn you, there are forces moving behind the scenes that want to see this investigation shut down. You're stepping on some very powerful toes." Emily nodded, though the senator couldn't see her. "I appreciate the warning, Senator, but we're not stopping. The truth needs to come out, no matter how powerful the people involved are." The senator sighed. "I figured you'd say that. Just be careful. They're already working to discredit you, leaking false information to the press, trying to paint you as an overzealous agent with a personal vendetta." Emily clenched her jaw. "Let them try. The evidence will speak for itself." After hanging up, Emily couldn't shake the unease that settled in her stomach. She knew she was being watched, and that the people she was going after had resources far beyond her own. But she wasn't about to let them intimidate her. As she prepared for the next phase of the investigation, Emily called a meeting with her team. They needed to be united, focused, and ready for whatever came next. "The opposition is ramping up," Emily said as her team gathered in the conference room. "They're going to try to tear us apart, through the media, through political pressure, maybe even threats. But we can't let that stop us. We have to stay one step ahead of them." Jackson nodded in agreement. "We've been compiling everything we have. It's airtight. We've just got to make sure it gets to the right people before they can bury it." The room was tense, but the determination in everyone's eyes was clear. They were ready for the fight ahead, no matter the cost. The day of James's trial arrived, and the courthouse was swarming with media. Crowds had gathered outside, chanting for justice and holding signs that demanded accountability for those in power. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Every seat filled with people eager to witness the downfall of a corrupt officer. Emily sat at the front of the courtroom, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as the trial began. She had spent months preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and ensuring that every detail of James's crimes would be exposed. But now that the moment was here, she felt a knot of anxiety in her chest. There was always the risk that something could go wrong, that James's lawyers would find a way to twist the truth. The prosecution presented its case, laying out the evidence of James's corruption, his abuse of power, and his involvement in the larger criminal network. Witness after witness testified, recounting the ways in which James had used his position to exploit and harm those who stood in his way. Emily watched as the jury listened intently, their faces a mix of shock and disgust. But when it came time for the defense to present its case, James's lawyer took a different approach. "This isn't about corruption," the lawyer said, his voice smooth and calculated. "This is about an overzealous FBI agent who has a personal vendetta against my client. Agent Johnson has a history of targeting officers who don't fit her narrow view of justice." Emily's stomach churned as the lawyer continued to attack her character. painting her as the villain in the story. She had known this was coming, but it still stung to hear her integrity questioned so publicly. The trial dragged on for days, with both sides presenting their arguments. But in the end, the truth was undeniable. The evidence was too strong, too damning, for even the most skilled lawyer to refute. When the jury returned with their verdict, the room fell silent. Emily held her breath as the foreman stood and read the words she had been waiting to hear. Guilty on all counts. The room erupted in cheers, but Emily remained still, her heart pounding. It was over. James had been convicted, and justice had been served. But as the reporters swarmed outside the courthouse, Emily knew that this was just the beginning of a much larger battle. In the weeks following the trial, the investigation into the wider network of corruption continued. With James in prison, more people were coming forward, offering testimony and evidence that exposed the depths of the systemic racism and abuse that had plagued the city for years. Emily's phone rang constantly, with calls from journalists, activists, and even politicians, all eager to learn more about what had been uncovered. The media coverage had sparked a national conversation, and protests were erupting across the country as people demanded change. One afternoon, Emily sat down for an interview with a major news network. The interviewer, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for hard-hitting questions, didn't waste any time. "Agent Johnson, your investigation has exposed a level of corruption that many Americans didn't realize existed. What do you think this means for the future of law enforcement in our country?" Emily took a deep breath before answering. "What we've uncovered goes beyond just one officer or one department. This is about a system that has allowed racism and abuse of power to flourish unchecked for too long. But now, people are waking up. They're demanding accountability, and that's something we can't ignore." The interviewer nodded, but her next question was more pointed. "Do you think this will lead to real change, or is this just another moment that will pass without lasting reform?" Emily thought for a moment before responding. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without a fight. But I believe we're at a tipping point. People are no longer willing to accept the status quo. They want justice, and they want equality. And it's up to all of us, law enforcement, politicians, and everyday citizens, to make sure that happens." As the interview ended, Emily felt a renewed sense of purpose. The battle was far from over, but the tide was turning. For the first time in her career, she felt like real change was within reach. Months had passed since the trial, and Emily's life had settled into a new rhythm. The media frenzy had died down, and the investigation was now in the hands of a special task force that continued to dig into the corruption that had been exposed. One morning, as she was getting ready for work, Emily received a letter in the mail. It was from the family of one of the victims of James's abuse, a young black man who had been wrongfully arrested and brutalized by the officer years ago. Emily's hands trembled as she opened the letter, unsure of what it would say. The letter was simple but heartfelt. The family thanked her for her courage, for standing up to someone as powerful as James, and for giving them the justice they had been denied for so long. Tears filled Emily's eyes as she read the words. This was why she did what she did, why she had chosen this path, despite all the obstacles and dangers. That evening, Emily stood on the balcony of her apartment, looking out at the city below. The lights flickered in the distance and the sounds of life filled the air. She knew there was still so much work to be done, so many battles yet to be fought. But for now, she allowed herself to feel a sense of peace. James had been defeated. His network of corruption was crumbling, and Emily Johnson was just getting started. Months after James's conviction, Emily sat in a small cafe downtown. The city outside bustled with life. But within the walls of the cafe, it was peaceful, a rare moment of calm that Emily hadn't experienced in a long time. She took a sip of her coffee, feeling the warmth spread through her body, but her mind was already on the next steps. Since James's conviction, the FBI's investigation had intensified. Dozens of officers, politicians, and high-ranking officials had been implicated in the corruption scandal, and the system was finally being dismantled piece by piece. But the backlash was fierce. Emily and her team had received threats, some anonymous, others more direct. The powerful individuals she had exposed weren't going down without a fight. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was Jackson, her most trusted colleague, and now her closest friend after all they'd been through. "Emily, we need to talk. There's something big happening." She felt a surge of tension but responded calmly. "Where are you?" "I'm on my way." They arranged to meet at a secure location, a discreet safe house where they'd held previous meetings during the investigation. Emily gathered her things, paid for her coffee, and walked out into the city, her mind already racing with possibilities of what Jackson might have uncovered. As she made her way to the safe house, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something even bigger than before. At the safe house, Jackson sat at a table with several other key agents, all of them looking grim. Emily entered, and the room went silent. Jackson slid a folder toward her. "This is it, Emily. We've found the final layer." Emily opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was reading. This was more than just corruption in law enforcement. It went all the way to the top. Prominent political figures, including those in positions of national power, had been connected to the criminal network James had been part of. They had used their influence to suppress investigations, control the narrative, and maintain power by exploiting racial divisions. This is bigger than anything we've seen before," Emily muttered. Jackson nodded. "Bigger and more dangerous. If we go after these people, we're going to be facing an all-out war. They have resources, connections, and they're not afraid to use them." Emily's heart pounded. They had fought so hard to get this far, but now they were standing on the precipice of a fight that could destroy careers, reputations, and possibly even lives. But she knew she couldn't back down, not now. "We have to do it," she said, her voice steady. "We've come too far to let this go. We need to take this to the public." Jackson looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "If we do this, we'll need protection. They'll come after you first." Emily didn't flinch. She had been through enough to know that the fight for justice wasn't without personal cost. "I'm ready," she said. "Let's bring them down." Once the final phase of the investigation was made public, all hell broke loose. The media erupted with coverage of the scandal, exposing the names of politicians, business leaders, and law enforcement officials involved in the corruption. Public outrage reached a fever pitch, with protests growing even larger than before. People were calling for mass resignations, arrests, and full accountability. But as expected, the backlash was swift and brutal. The powerful figures who had been exposed weren't going down quietly. They launched a full-scale smear campaign against Emily, accusing her of fabricating evidence, overstepping her authority, and being driven by a personal vendetta. Emily's name was dragged through the mud in every major news outlet. Anonymous threats increased, and she had to have round-the-clock security as a precaution. Her reputation, once sterling, was now being questioned by people in positions of influence. It was clear that they were trying to destroy her credibility before she could destroy them. At night, Emily would sit in her apartment, her phone buzzing constantly with updates from Jackson and the task force. She rarely slept, the weight of the fight pressing down on her. But she never considered giving up. She had anticipated this, and though it hurt to be attacked so viciously, she knew the truth was on her side. One evening, while watching a news segment about the latest smear campaign against her, Emily received a call. It was from a man named Marcus Thompson, a prominent civil rights leader who had been following her case closely. "Agent Johnson, I just want you to know that you're not alone in this fight. The community stands with you." Emily felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. Marcus had been instrumental in advocating for justice and equality, and his support meant more than she could express. "Thank you, Marcus. It means a lot," she said softly, feeling the strength of his words bolster her resolve. "You've uncovered something that's been hidden for too long," Marcus continued. "But these people, they're going to come at you with everything they've got. You need to be prepared for that." "I am," Emily replied. "I'm not backing down." "I didn't think you would," Marcus said with a chuckle. "Just remember, the truth always wins, and you're on the right side of history." As the investigation neared its final stages, Emily and her team prepared for the inevitable confrontation with the most powerful figures they had exposed. They had gathered irrefutable evidence, wiretaps, financial records, testimony from whistleblowers that would be impossible to ignore. But as the task force prepared to make their final moves, something unexpected happened. A leak. Someone from within the investigation had betrayed them, passing crucial information to the very people they were targeting. Emily received the news late one night as she was going over the final pieces of evidence. "Emily, it's Jackson. We've been compromised." Her heart sank. "What do you mean?" "Someone from the inside leaked our strategy. They know we're coming for them, and they've already started covering their tracks." Emily gripped the phone tightly, her mind racing. This was the last thing they needed. "Do we know who it was?" "Not yet," Jackson replied, "but we're running out of time. If we don't move now, they're going to bury everything." Emily felt a surge of anger and frustration. After everything they had been through, someone had betrayed them at the final hour. But she refused to let this stop them. "We're moving forward," she said firmly. "We'll go public with everything we have. No more waiting." Jackson agreed, and they set the plan in motion. Within hours, they called a press conference, presenting the full scope of the corruption to the public. Emily stood in front of the cameras, her face calm but her voice strong as she detailed the crimes and abuses of power that had been uncovered. "This is about justice," she said, looking directly into the camera. "This is about holding those in power accountable for their actions. No one is above the law." The public response was immediate. The evidence was too overwhelming to ignore, and the pressure on the corrupt officials grew with every passing day. In the following weeks, arrests were made. High-ranking officials who had once seemed untouchable were now facing charges, their power stripped away as the truth came to light. The justice system, for all its flaws, was finally doing its job. But the battle wasn't without its casualties. Emily had lost friends, her reputation had been tarnished, and her trust in the system she had once believed in was shattered. Yet in the midst of it all, she found solace in the fact that she had done what was right. She had exposed the darkness that had been festering for too long, and the light of truth was now shining on it. One afternoon, as she was walking through the city, a woman approached her. She was holding the hand of a young boy, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Agent Johnson?" the woman asked, her voice soft but filled with emotion. Emily smiled. "Yes? I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "You've made a difference. For people like us." For my son, Emily looked down at the boy, who stared up at her with wide eyes. She felt a lump form in her throat. This was why she had fought so hard. For the future. For people like this boy who deserved to grow up in a world where justice wasn't determined by the color of your skin or the power you held. "Thank you," Emily said quietly, feeling the weight of the moment. As the woman and her son walked away, Emily stood there, watching them disappear into the crowd. The city around her was still buzzing with life, but for the first time in a long while, she felt at peace. Emily sat in her apartment that evening, reflecting on everything that had happened. The investigation had taken so much from her peace of mind, her sense of security, but it had also given her a renewed sense of purpose. She had fought for justice, not just for herself, but for countless others who had been silenced by a corrupt system. Her phone buzzed, and she saw a message from Jackson. "They got him. James was sentenced today, 25 years minimum. Justice is served." Emily smiled, a small but genuine smile. It wasn't just about James anymore. It was about dismantling the entire corrupt system he had represented. And while the fight was far from over, this was a victory worth celebrating. As the sun set over the city, Emily stood on her balcony, watching the lights flicker to life. She knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to fight, but for now she allowed herself to feel the satisfaction of knowing that justice, though slow, had prevailed, and she was ready for whatever came next.